The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Dry Creek as Jacob Hale guided his tired mare into town. 3 weeks on the cattle trail had left him weather-beaten and weary, his clothes thick with dust and his throat parched for something stronger than trail coffee. The familiar storefronts of the small frontier town should have been a welcome sight, but something felt different today, a tension in the air that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Jacob had been riding these lands for 15 years, ever since he'd claimed his homestead north of town. He'd learned to read the moods of a place like some men read the weather. Today, Dry Creek felt like a storm waiting to break. As he dismounted outside Morrison's general store, intending to pick up supplies before heading to the saloon, he noticed the unusual cluster of people near Boyd Mather's establishment. The Red Moon Saloon was always busy this time of day, but the crowd seemed different, quieter, more purposeful. Some stood with their backs turned, creating a human wall, while others glanced nervously over their shoulders. Jacob tied his mare to the hitching post and walked closer, his spurs jangling softly against the wooden boardwalk. That's when he saw her, a young native woman, perhaps 17 summers old, knelt in the dirt beside the saloon's side entrance. Heavy iron shackles bound her wrists. The chain looped through a metal ring bolted to a thick wooden post. Her doeskin dress was torn at the shoulder, revealing bruised skin beneath. Dark hair hung loose around her face, partially obscuring features that spoke of both youth and a premature hardening that came from witnessing too much cruelty. What struck Jacob most forcefully wasn't the chains or the bruises. It was her eyes. When she lifted her gaze to meet his, he saw no plea for help, no desperate hope. Instead, there was only a cold acceptance, as if she had already reconciled herself to whatever fate awaited her. That look hit him like a physical blow, dragging up memories he'd spent years trying to bury. 20 years ago, he'd been a boy in Missouri, watching his father stand by while neighbors dragged a freedman behind a horse for the crime of looking at a white woman. His father had gripped young Jacob's shoulder hard enough to bruise, whispering, "Sometimes keeping quiet is how you stay alive, son." But Jacob had never forgotten the man's eyes, that same terrible acceptance of injustice. "Move along, Hale." The gravelly voice belonged to Boyd Mathers himself, emerging from the saloon with a leather money pouch in one hand and his other resting casually on the ivory handle of his Colt .45. Boyd was a big man, gone to fat in recent years but still dangerous. His fine clothes and gold watch chain marked him as one of Dry Creek's more prosperous citizens. "This ain't none of your concern." Jacob didn't move. "Since when do we chain people like animals in the middle of town?" Boyd's laugh was as cold as winter wind. "Since when do you care about Indian business? This here's a legal matter, contracted labor, all proper and documented." He patted a folded paper tucked into his vest pocket. "Got the territorial seal and everything?" "He contracted labor," Jacob repeated flatly. He'd heard those words before, usually covering all manner of sins. His eyes swept the crowd, recognizing faces he'd known for years. Tom Garrett from the feed store studied his boots. Martha Henshaw clutched her shopping basket tighter and hurried past. Even old Pete Sullivan, who'd never backed down from a fight in his life, found something fascinating to examine in the middle distance. The girl shifted slightly, the chains clanking with a sound that seemed to echo down the street. When Jacob took a step toward her, she gave an almost imperceptible shake of her head, her eyes flashing a warning. "Not yet," that look seemed to say. "Not here. Best you head on to wherever you were going." Another voice added. Sheriff Dalton had materialized from the gathering crowd, his badge catching the dying sunlight. He was younger than Boyd, appointed just last year when the previous sheriff died under mysterious circumstances. Clean-shaven and neat. He looked more like a banker than a lawman, but the way his hand hovered near his gun suggested he knew how to use it. Wouldn't want any misunderstandings to disturb the peace. Jacob felt the familiar weight of his own Remington at his hip but kept his hands visible and still. He'd learned long ago that the man who drew first wasn't always the one who walked away. Seems to me the peace is already disturbed. Sheriff. Hard to call it peaceful when there's a young woman chained up like livestock. A murmur ran through the crowd. Some shifted uncomfortably, others pressed closer, drawn by the scent of confrontation like vultures to carrion. Jacob spotted Doc Rourke pushing through the gathering, his medical bag in hand. The doctor was one of the few men in town Jacob genuinely respected, a former Union Army surgeon who'd seen too much death to be intimidated by local bullies. "Gentlemen," Doc Rourke said in his measured Boston accent, "perhaps we could discuss this matter somewhere more private." His eyes met Jacob's briefly, conveying a silent message. "There's more here than you know. Be careful." But Jacob's attention had returned to the girl. Now that he was closer, he could see the other marks of abuse. Rope burns on her ankles, a half-healed cut on her cheek. The way she held herself suggested ribs that might be cracked or bruised. His jaw tightened. Whatever legal arrangement Boyd claimed, this went beyond any legitimate contract. The girl must have sensed his growing anger because she spoke for the first time, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly in the tense silence. "They have others." The words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples through the crowd. Boyd's face flushed red and his hand tightened on his gun. "Shut your mouth, girl, or what?" Jacob interrupted, his voice deadly quiet. "You'll beat her some more? Chain her tighter?" He addressed the crowd now, raising his voice. "Is this what Dry Creek has become? A place where we let women be treated worse than dogs?" "You don't know what you're talking about, Hale," Sheriff Dalton said. But there was a defensive edge to his voice now. "This woman's a thief, caught red-handed. The contract is her alternative to jail time." "Jail time," Jacob repeated. "And what exactly did she steal?" The silence stretched uncomfortably. Boyd and Dalton exchanged glances. Finally, Boyd spat into the dust. "Food. From my storeroom." "Food." Jacob let the word hang in the air. "And for the crime of being hungry, she's chained like this?" Doc Rourke cleared his throat. "If I might examine the young woman, just to ensure she's healthy enough for this contracted labor?" The doctor's tone was neutral, professional. But Jacob caught the underlying steel. "No need for that," Boyd said quickly, and too quickly. "No, she's fine." But Doc Rourke was already kneeling beside the girl, his fingers gentle as he examined her wrists where the shackles had rubbed them raw. The girl remained still, but her eyes tracked every movement, every person, like a wild animal calculating escape routes. "These wounds are infected," Doc Rourke announced, loud enough for all to hear. "And these bruises." He carefully lifted the edge of her torn dress, revealing more dark marks across her ribs. "These aren't from any simple arrest. This is systematic abuse." The crowd stirred uneasily. Whatever stories they'd told themselves about law and order, the physical evidence was harder to ignore. Jacob saw doubt creeping into some faces, though whether it would be enough to overcome their fear remained to be seen. "Now see here, Doc," Sheriff Dalton started, but Jacob cut him off. "The lady said there are others. Where are they?" The girl's eyes met his again, and this time he saw something flicker there. Not hope exactly, but recognition. Recognition that here, finally, was someone who might actually listen. "The old mine," she whispered. "North of town. 6 of my people." "Here she's lying," Boyd snarled, but the quick look he shot Sheriff Dalton suggested otherwise. "Trying to stir up trouble. Then you won't mind if some of us ride out there to verify her story." Jacob said it wasn't a question. The tension ratcheted up another notch. Several men in the crowd shifted, and Jacob noticed they all wore similar dust-colored dusters despite the warm weather, perfect for concealing weapons. Boyd's men, no doubt. The situation was more organized than he'd first thought. "Nobody's riding anywhere," Sheriff Dalton said, his hand now firmly on his gun butt. "This is a legal matter, and I'll handle it according to the law." The law. Doc Rourke stood slowly, his voice carrying quiet authority. "Speaking of the law, Sheriff, I recall a traveling merchant asking similar questions about missing people a few months back. Whatever happened to him?" The sheriff's face went pale. "That was an accident. His horse spooked, threw him into the ravine." "Ah, yes," Doc Rourke said. "An accident, how convenient." Jacob had heard enough. In one smooth motion, he drew his knife, not his gun, which would have triggered a shootout, but the heavy Bowie knife from his belt. Before anyone could react, he knelt beside the girl and began working at the lock on her shackles. "Stop right there." Sheriff Dalton's gun cleared leather, pointing straight at Jacob's back. The crowd scattered, some diving for cover while others pressed against building walls. Several of Boyd's men also drew their weapons. Jacob didn't stop working at the lock. "You going to shoot an unarmed man in the back, Sheriff, in front of all these witnesses? You're interfering with the law." "No," Jacob said, feeling the lock give way under his knife point. "I'm upholding it. The real law, not whatever you and Boyd have cooked up." The shackles fell away with a clatter. He stood slowly, turning to face the sheriff's gun. "If you want to stop me, you'll have to shoot me. Shoot." The girl rose unsteadily to her feet, rubbing her raw wrists. When she spoke again, her voice was stronger, carrying the authority of her heritage. "I am Naya, daughter of Chief Black Elk of the Northern Shoshone. These men took us from our hunting grounds, claimed we were trespassing on territorial land. They've been selling our people like cattle." The crowd erupted. Some voices rose in outrage, whether at the revelation or at Naya's boldness. Jacob couldn't tell. Others called for order. A few slipped away quietly, no doubt to carry word to interested parties. "She's lying," Boyd roared, but the desperation in his voice undermined his words. "Sheriff, arrest them both." Sheriff Dalton's gun wavered. He was young, probably in over his head, and the situation was spiraling beyond his control. Jacob could see him calculating, his duty to Boyd and whoever else was involved in this scheme against the growing crowd pressure and the very public nature of what was happening. It was Doc Rourke who tipped the balance. "I'll be filing a full report with the territorial governor," he announced. "Complete medical documentation of this young woman's injuries, and I suspect once word reaches the Army about possible trafficking of native peoples, they'll be very interested in investigating." "The Army doesn't give a damn about Indians," Boyd spat. "Perhaps not," Doc Rourke agreed. "But they care very much about maintaining treaties and preventing wars. How do you think Chief Black Elk will react when he learns his daughter has been enslaved?" That name carried weight. Black Elk was known as a peaceful chief, but also as a fierce warrior when provoked. The implications of kidnapping his daughter began to sink in among the crowd. Jacob kept his eyes on Sheriff Dalton's gun, still pointed at his chest. "Your move, Sheriff. You can escalate this into bloodshed, or you can lower that weapon and let justice take its proper course." For a long moment, the street held its breath. Then, slowly, Sheriff Dalton lowered his gun. Nobody leaves town until this is sorted out, he said, trying to salvage some authority. That includes you, Hale. Wouldn't dream of it, Jacob replied. He turned to Naya, who stood tall despite her injuries. Can you ride? She nodded. I can do whatever is necessary to save my people. Then we're going to need horses and men willing to ride north. Jacob addressed the crowd. Who among you will help right this wrong? The silence stretched uncomfortably long. Then old Pete Sullivan stepped forward, his grizzled face set with determination. I'll ride with you. Hale. Been too long since this town stood for something decent. One by one, others followed. Not many, maybe a dozen men out of the crowd of 50, but enough. Doc Rourke volunteered to come along to tend any injured they might find. Even young Tommy Morrison, barely 18, grabbed his father's rifle and joined the group. Boyd's face had gone from red to purple. You're making a mistake, Hale. You don't know who you're crossing. Maybe not, Jacob agreed. But I know who I am, and I know what's right. He helped Naya toward his horse, noting how she moved with quiet dignity despite her ordeal. We'll need supplies for whoever we find at that mine. Food, water, medical provisions. I'll gather what's needed. Martha Henshaw spoke up unexpectedly, her earlier fear replaced by determination. And I'll make sure the whole town knows what's happening here. As the group prepared to ride out, Jacob caught Naya studying him with those dark, knowing eyes. Why? She asked simply. He thought of his father, of choices made and unmade, of all the times he'd kept quiet when he should have spoken up. Because someone has to, he said finally, and because I've been quiet too long. She nodded as if this answer satisfied her. As they mounted up, Sheriff Dalton called out one last warning. This isn't over, Hale. There are forces at work here bigger than you know. Jacob touched the brim of his hat in mock salute. Then I guess we'd better get started on evening the odds. As the rescue party rode out of Dry Creek, the sun finally dipped below the horizon, painting the sky the color of blood and promise. Behind them, the town buzzed with gossip and speculation. Ahead lay the old mine and whatever secrets it held. Jacob glanced at Naya riding beside him, her back straight despite exhaustion and pain. He'd crossed a line today, one that couldn't be uncrossed, but for the first time in years. Maybe since that terrible day in Missouri, he felt like he could meet his own eyes in the mirror. The real fight was just beginning. The rescue party had barely cleared the town limits when the sound of approaching horses made them pull up short. Jacob held up his hand, signaling a halt, his other hand moving instinctively to his rifle. Beside him, Naya tensed, her body coiled like a spring despite her injuries. Easy, Jacob murmured. Let's see who we're dealing with. 3 riders emerged from the growing darkness, and Jacob relaxed marginally when he recognized Father Brennan's distinctive silhouette. The Irish priest rode like a man who'd learned horsemanship out of necessity rather than choice. But he kept pace with his companions, Judge Harlan's clerk, William Prescott, and surprisingly, Mrs. Eleanor Worthington, the banker's widow. Father, Jacob nodded as they drew alongside. Didn't expect to see you out here. Father Brennan's weathered face was grim in the moonlight. When I heard what transpired in town, I couldn't very well stay behind. There are some sins that demand immediate action. His eyes found Naya. My child, are you well enough to travel? I am well enough to do what must be done, Naya replied, her voice steady. Mrs. Worthington, dressed in practical riding clothes rather than her usual finery, spoke up. I've brought additional medical supplies from my late husband's collection, and Mr. Prescott here has some Interesting information about the legal aspects of this situation. The nervous clerk adjusted his spectacles. I shouldn't be here. If Judge Harlan knew, the judge is in the territorial capital until week's end, Mrs. Worthington said sharply. What he doesn't know won't hurt him. Tell them what you told me, William. Prescott glanced around nervously before speaking in a rush. The contracts, the ones Boyd Mathers has been filing, they're forgeries. I've seen the judge's real seal, and these don't match. But someone's been entering them into the official records late at night. I think there's a whole system in place. A system, Doc Rourke repeated, his medical bag secured to his saddle. For trafficking human beings. We don't know that for certain, young Tommy Morrison said, though his voice lacked conviction. Don't we? Old Pete Sullivan spat tobacco juice into the dust. Been wondering why so many native folks passing through have gone missing these past months, and why Boyd's been spending money like water when his saloon ain't that profitable. Jacob processed this information as they resumed riding. The moon had risen full, casting the desert landscape in silver and shadow. The old mine lay about 5 miles north, abandoned since the silver played out a decade ago. It would be a perfect place to hold prisoners, isolated with existing structures and far enough from town that screams wouldn't carry. How many men does Boyd have? Jacob asked Naya quietly. She considered. At the mine, 6, maybe 7. They work in shifts. 2 always on guard. The others... She paused, her jaw tightening. The others oversee the work. What kind of work? Breaking rocks, hauling ore carts, they make us dig, searching for new veins of silver. Her voice carried a bitter edge. They say we're paying off our debt for trespassing, but the debt never shrinks, only grows. Father Brennan crossed himself. Slavery by another name. They rode in silence for a while, each lost in thought. Jacob found himself studying Naya from the corner of his eye. Despite everything she'd endured, she sat her borrowed horse with natural grace, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon. There was a strength in her that went beyond the physical, a core of steel that hadn't been broken by her captivity. There, she said suddenly, pointing to a rise ahead. Beyond that ridge, you'll smell the camp before you see it. She was right. As they crested the ridge, the wind brought the distinctive odors of too many people in too small a space, unwashed bodies, waste, and the acrid tang of fear. Below them, the old mine buildings squatted like toads in the moonlight. A few lanterns glowed in windows, and they could see figures moving about. We need a plan, Doc Rourke said softly. We can't just ride in there. Why not? Tommy Morrison asked, his young face eager for action. We've got the numbers. And they've got hostages, Jacob reminded him. First sign of trouble, they might harm the prisoners. He turned to Naya. Tell us the layout. She drew in the dirt with a stick, her movements quick and precise. The main shaft is sealed, too dangerous. They keep us in the old equipment shed here. She marked an X. Guards are posted here and here. The overseers sleep in the foreman's office. There's a back entrance through the old cooling tunnels, but it's partially collapsed. I could fit through, Tommy volunteered. No, Mrs. Worthington spoke with surprising authority. I'll go. Everyone turned to stare at her. She lifted her chin defiantly. I'm smaller than young Thomas, and I've crawled through tighter spaces helping my husband inspect mine investments. Besides, they won't expect a woman. Eleanor, Father Brennan began, but she cut him off. Don't Eleanor me, Father. I've stood by too long while evil flourished in our town. My husband's money probably helped finance some of this, even if he didn't know it. I need to do this. Jacob weighed the options. It was risky. but she had a point about her size and the element of surprise. "All right, but you'll need someone with you in case there's trouble." "I'll go," Prescott said, surprising everyone, including himself. I'm tired of being afraid, tired of keeping silent while knowing things are wrong." "God bless you both," Father Brennan murmured. They spent the next few minutes planning. Mrs. Worthington and Prescott would infiltrate through the collapsed tunnel, locate the prisoners, and signal when they were ready. The main group would create a distraction at the front, drawing the guards away. "What kind of signal?" Pete Sullivan asked. Mrs. Worthington smiled grimly and produced a small pistol from her riding jacket. "My husband taught me to shoot 3 shots, rapid succession," as the 2 volunteers disappeared into the darkness. Jacob organized the remaining riders. They tied the horses a safe distance away and approached on foot, using the mining equipment scattered about for cover. The night sounds of the desert, coyotes howling, wind through rocks, masked their movement. They had just reached position when things went wrong. A shout erupted from the direction of the collapsed tunnel, followed by the crash of falling rocks. Lanterns flared to life across the camp as guards scrambled from their posts. "So much for surprise," Pete muttered. Go," Jacob ordered, breaking cover, before they can organize." The rescue party charged forward, weapons drawn. Jacob saw 2 guards raising rifles and dropped them both with quick shots. Beside him, Naya had somehow acquired a pickaxe handle and wielded it with deadly efficiency, dropping a man who tried to grab her. The camp erupted into chaos. Guards fired wildly into the darkness while prisoners' voices rose in hope and fear from the equipment shed. Jacob fought his way toward the building, Doc Rourke surprisingly effective at his side with an old army revolver. "The keys," Naya shouted. "The big guard has them." Jacob spotted the man she meant, a giant with a beard like a bird's nest, swinging a shotgun toward the shed where the prisoners were kept. If he fired through those thin walls? Without thinking, Jacob launched himself at the man, tackling him around the waist. They went down hard, rolling in the dirt. The guard was stronger, but Jacob was desperate. They grappled for the shotgun until it discharged harmlessly into the air. Then Naya was there, bringing the pickaxe handle down on the guard's head with a sound like a melon dropping. The man went limp, and Jacob grabbed the ring of keys from his belt. "Here." He tossed them to Father Brennan, who had reached the shed door. "Get them out!" The priest worked frantically at the lock while the battle raged around them. Tommy Morrison was holding his own against a guard twice his size, while Pete Sullivan had another pinned down behind a water trough. Even Mrs. Worthington had emerged from somewhere, her small pistol barking as she covered Prescott, who was helping wounded prisoners from a secondary building. The shed door burst open and prisoners streamed out, men, women, even children, all bearing the marks of hard labor and harsh treatment. Among them, Jacob spotted several Native Americans who rushed to Naya, speaking rapidly in their own language. "My father?" she asked urgently in English. The older woman shook her head. "They moved him yesterday, said he was going to the special buyer." Naya's face went pale. "We have to—" "He behind you!" Doc Rourke shouted. Jacob spun to see Boyd Mathers himself, flanked by Sheriff Dalton and a dozen armed men. They must have followed from town, riding hard. Boyd's face was twisted with rage, his fancy clothes dusty from the ride. "Drop your weapons," Sheriff Dalton commanded. "All of you, you're under arrest for interfering with legal territorial business." "Legal?" Father Brennan stepped forward, shielding newly freed prisoners with his body. "There's nothing legal about this abomination." "I have contracts," Boyd began. "Forged contracts," Prescott interrupted, finding courage from somewhere. "I've seen the real territorial seal, Mr. Mathers. Yours don't match." Boyd's eyes narrowed dangerously. You little weasel, I'll see you hanged for theft of official documents. The only thieves here, Mrs. Worthington said clearly, are those who steal human freedom. The two groups faced each other, weapons drawn, tension crackling like lightning before a storm. Jacob calculated odds rapidly. They had freed the prisoners, but Boyd's reinforcements gave him superior numbers. And with the sheriff backing him, even a victory here would mean outlawry for all of them. Then Naya stepped forward, and her voice carried the authority of generations. I am the daughter of Black Elk, war chief of the Northern Shoshone. These are my people you have enslaved. Their suffering is my suffering, and their chains are my chains. She raised her voice so all could hear. And their vengeance will be mine to deliver. Threats from a savage, Boyd sneered, but Jacob noticed several of his men shifting uneasily. The Shoshone were peaceful when left alone, but their warriors were legendary when roused to war. Not threats, Naya said calmly. Promises you think your papers and laws protect you? My father commands 2,000 warriors. When he learns what you've done to his people, to his daughter, do you think your sheriff's badge will stop them? Sheriff Dalton had gone pale. Now wait a minute. I didn't know nothing about her being a chief's daughter. Boyd said. Boyd says many things, a new voice interrupted. Everyone turned to see a rider approaching, a man in a long duster and a distinctive badge, a U.S. Marshal's badge. Marshal Tate, Sheriff Dalton stammered. What are you doing here? The marshal, a grizzled veteran with eyes like chips of flint, surveyed the scene. Got word of some interesting activities in these parts. Seems I arrived just in time. His gaze found Boyd. Mr. Mathers, I'll be needing to see those contracts you're so proud of. This is a local matter, Boyd protested. Not when it involves the trafficking of persons across territorial lines. Marshal Tate replied. That makes it federal, and from what I'm seeing here, you've got a lot of explaining to do. Boyd's hand twitched toward his gun, but froze when he found himself looking down the barrels of multiple weapons. His own men were backing away, suddenly reluctant to be associated with whatever was happening. Smart choice, the marshal said. Now everybody lower those weapons. We're going to sort this out proper-like. As weapons slowly lowered, Jacob felt some of the tension ease, but Naya remained rigid beside him. What about my father? She asked the marshal. They said he was taken to a special buyer. Marshal Tate's expression darkened. Then we'd better have ourselves a real frank conversation with Mr. Mathers about his business associates. He looked at Sheriff Dalton. You can either be part of the solution, Sheriff, or part of the problem. Choose quick. Dalton looked between Boyd and the marshal, then slowly removed his badge and handed it over. I didn't know it was this bad. Boyd said it was just contract labor, keeping vagrants from causing trouble. Ignorance ain't innocence, the marshal said, pocketing the badge. But cooperation might buy you leniency. As Boyd and his remaining supporters were disarmed and restrained, Jacob found himself standing next to Naya. The immediate danger had passed, but he could see the worry in her eyes. We'll find him, he said quietly. Your father. We'll get him back. She looked at him, and for the first time since he'd seen her chained in town, something like hope flickered in her eyes. Why do you care so much? This isn't your fight. Jacob thought of his father again, of all the times he'd stayed silent when he should have spoken. Maybe it wasn't, but it is now. Around them, the freed prisoners were being tended by Doc Rourke and Father Brennan. Mrs. Worthington and Prescott were documenting everything, gathering evidence. The night's work had revealed something rotten at the heart of Dry Creek, but also something else, that there were still people willing to stand against injustice. This isn't over, Boyd snarled as he was led away. You don't know who you're messing with. There are people higher up than me, people with real power. Then I guess we'll be meeting them next, Jacob replied, as dawn began to break over the desert, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. The rescue party prepared to return to town with the freed prisoners. But Jacob knew this was only the beginning. Somewhere out there, Naya's father was in danger. And behind Boyd Mathers lay a network of corruption that reached who knew how high. The quiet rancher from north of town had started something that couldn't be stopped now. And standing beside the chief's daughter as the sun rose, Jacob realized he wouldn't have it any other way. The return to Dry Creek was unlike anything the town had witnessed in its dusty history. The main street, usually quiet at dawn, filled with people as word spread of the rescue party's approach. Women clutched shawls around their shoulders in the morning chill. Men emerged from doorways still buckling gun belts, and children peered from behind their mothers' skirts at the procession of freed prisoners. Jacob rode at the front alongside Marshall Tate, while Naya helped support a weakened elderly woman on horseback. Behind them came the others, Native Americans still bearing the marks of their captivity, Doc Rourke tending to those who could barely walk, Father Brennan offering quiet words of comfort, and Mrs. Worthington maintaining careful records of each person's name and story. Boyd Mathers, his hands bound, rode between two of the marshals' hastily deputized men. Sheriff Dalton followed, no longer wearing his badge but not quite a prisoner either, his status uncertain pending the marshal's investigation. As they entered town, Jacob noticed the crowd's reaction was far from unified. Some faces showed shock and sympathy. Others displayed anger, though whether at the revelation of slavery or at the disruption of the status quo was hard to tell. A few men slipped away into alleys, no doubt to carry word to interested parties. "We'll need somewhere to house these folks," Marshall Tate said quietly to Jacob. "And medical attention for the worst injured." "The church," Father Brennan called out, overhearing. "We have space and none will dare violate sanctuary." But even as he spoke, a commotion erupted near the bank. A group of well-dressed men pushed through the crowd, led by Judge Harland himself. The territorial judge was an imposing figure, tall, silver-haired, with the bearing of a man used to absolute authority. He must have returned from the capital earlier than expected. "Marshall Tate," the judge's voice boomed across the street. "What is the meaning of this disruption? I leave for a few days and return to find chaos." The marshal touched his hat brim politely but didn't dismount. "Judge Harland, good thing you're here. We've uncovered a trafficking ring operating out of Dry Creek. These folks were being held against their will at the old Brixton mine." "Preposterous," Judge Harland declared, though Jacob noticed his eyes flickered briefly to Boyd Mathers. "I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding. Mr. Mathers is a respected businessman, with forged contracts bearing what appears to be your seal." Prescott spoke up, his voice shaking but determined. The clerk had found unexpected courage, though he paled when the judge's cold gaze fixed on him. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Prescott, one that could be considered slander against a territorial official." "It's not slander if it's true," Mrs. Worthington interjected. "I have examples of the forgeries right here, along with testimonies from the victims." The crowd murmured, tension crackling like heat lightning. Jacob saw hands moving to weapons on both sides. The judge had brought his own men, hard cases who looked more like hired guns than legal assistants. "Everyone calm down," Marshall Tate commanded, his voice carrying the authority of federal law. "Judge, I'll need you to come to the sheriff's office. We have questions about these contracts and your possible involvement." "This is outrageous," Judge Harland's face flushed. I am a duly appointed territorial judge. You have no authority. I have all the authority I need when federal crimes are involved. The marshal interrupted. Now, we can do this peacefully, or... He let the threat hang. That's when Naya spoke, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. While you argue about papers and authority, my father is being sold like cattle. Every moment wasted is a moment closer to losing him forever. She slipped from her horse and approached Judge Harlan directly, ignoring the hands that moved to stop her. There was something in her bearing, a dignity that transcended her torn dress and visible injuries that made even hardened gunmen step back. You know where he is, she stated, looking directly at the judge. The special buyer Boyd mentioned. You know because you arranged it. I don't know what you're talking about, Judge Harlan replied, but sweat beaded on his forehead despite the morning cool. Then you won't mind if we search your office, Marshal Tate suggested. Check your recent correspondence, financial records. You'll need a warrant for that. No, a new voice said. He won't. Everyone turned to see Samuel Fletcher, the territorial prosecutor, emerging from the crowd. A thin, bookish man who most had dismissed as ineffectual. He now held a leather portfolio with an official seal. I've been conducting my own investigation for months. Fletcher announced, Governor's orders. We've suspected corruption in the territorial courts, and recent events have provided the evidence we needed. He produced a document. This is a warrant for your arrest, Judge Harlan, on charges of corruption, trafficking in persons, and conspiracy. The street erupted. Judge Harlan's men went for their guns, but the marshal's deputies were ready. Shots rang out, women screamed, and Jacob found himself diving from his horse, pulling Naya down with him behind a water trough as bullets whined overhead. The firefight was brief but vicious. When the smoke cleared, 2 of the judge's gunmen lay dead in the street, 3 others wounded. Judge Harlan himself had tried to flee but was brought down by Pete Sullivan, who'd managed to get behind him during the chaos. Is anyone hurt? Doc Rourke called out, already moving to tend the wounded regardless of which side they'd been on. Oh, just scratches, Jacob replied, helping Naya to her feet. She had a graze on her arm where a bullet had come too close, but her eyes blazed with determination rather than fear. As Judge Harlan was hauled to his feet, his dignity shattered, Naya approached him again. My father. Where is he? The judge's mouth remained stubbornly closed until Marshal Tate spoke quietly. You're looking at a rope, Harlan, trafficking, murder of that merchant Doc mentioned. Who knows what else we'll find? But cooperation might get you life in prison instead of hanging. Judge Harlan's shoulders sagged. The syndicate, he said finally. They run operations across 3 territories. Your father. They wanted him specifically. Said a Shoshone war chief would bring top dollar from certain collectors back east who fancy themselves Indian experts. Collectors, Naya repeated, her voice dripping contempt. Where? There's a way station 40 miles east, Canyon Springs. They hold special auctions there, away from prying eyes. He looked at Boyd Mathers with disgust. This fool's greed brought you all down on us. We had a smooth operation until he got careless. Smooth operation, Father Brennan said sadly. How many souls have you stolen? How many families torn apart? The judge didn't answer, but his silence spoke volumes. We need to move fast, Jacob said to Marshal Tate. If word gets to this Canyon Springs about what's happened here, already thinking the same. The marshal turned to address the crowd. I need volunteers for a posse. This is dangerous work against organized criminals, so I won't order anyone. But if you've got the stomach for it, count me in, Pete Sullivan said immediately. "And me," Tommy Morrison added, still flushed from his first real gunfight. Others stepped forward. Some Jacob expected. Others surprised him. Even William Prescott volunteered, though his hands shook as he did so. "I'll need to stay here," Doc Rourke said reluctantly. "These people need medical attention, but Mrs. Worthington and I can coordinate with Prosecutor Fletcher to document everything, build the legal case." As the posse organized, Jacob found himself alone with Naya for a moment. The morning sun caught the lights in her dark hair, and despite everything, he found himself struck by her fierce beauty. "You don't have to come," she said quietly. "You've done more than enough. This isn't your fight." "I thought we'd settled that," Jacob replied. "Besides, someone needs to watch your back. You tend to walk into the middle of trouble." A ghost of a smile touched her lips, the first he'd seen from her. "And you don't?" Before he could respond, a disturbance near the church caught their attention. Some of the freed prisoners were arguing with townspeople, voices raised in anger. Jacob and Naya hurried over to find the conflict centered around resources, food, medical supplies, temporary shelter. "We can't support all these people," a merchant was saying. "We have our own families to think about. These people were enslaved in our town," Mrs. Worthington countered sharply. "We have a moral obligation." "A moral obligation don't put food on the table," someone else argued. The freed prisoners, many still weak from their ordeal, stood clustered together, proud despite their circumstances. Jacob saw how the town's reaction hurt them almost as much as their captivity had. Naya stepped into the middle of the argument. "You worry about resources? My people know how to hunt, how to find water in the desert, how to survive on land you consider worthless. We don't ask for your charity. We ask only for what was stolen from us, our freedom and our family members still missing." "But where will you go?" Father Brennan asked gently. "Your homes are far from here. First, we get our people back," Naya said firmly. "Then we return to our lands, and we remember who helped us and who didn't." That last comment carried weight. The Shoshone controlled important trading routes, water sources, and hunting grounds. Their friendship or enmity could make a significant difference to a frontier town's prosperity. "The church will provide immediate aid," Father Brennan declared. "And I'll be having words with any Christian who refuses to help their fellow human beings in need." As the crowd dispersed, some shamefaced, others still grumbling, Marshal Tate approached. "We're ready to ride. Got 15 good men, plus yourself if you're coming. Hail." "I'm coming," Jacob confirmed. He looked at Naya. "You should rest. That arm needs proper tending." "I'm coming too," she said in a tone that brooked no argument. "He's my father." The marshal started to object, then seemed to think better of it. "Can you shoot?" In response, Naya picked up a stone and hurled it with lightning speed, knocking a bottle off a fence post 30 yards away. "I can fight." "Good enough for me," the marshal said. "When we leave in 20 minutes and get supplies, ammunition, and fresh horses, this syndicate won't give up without a fight." As the posse prepared for departure, Jacob noticed Sheriff Dalton approaching hesitantly. The former lawman looked diminished without his badge, older somehow. "Hail," he said quietly. I want to come with you." "Why?" Jacob asked bluntly. Dalton's jaw worked. "Because I helped create this mess, even if I didn't know how deep it went. My cowardice let evil flourish. Maybe I can start making amends." Jacob studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Get a horse, but you ride where we can see you." As the expanded posse gathered at the edge of town, ready to ride for Canyon Springs, Jacob felt the weight of what they were attempting. They were going up against an organized criminal syndicate with resources and connections. The odds weren't good. But looking at the determined faces around him, Naya fierce with purpose, Pete Sullivan grim but resolved, even young Tommy Morrison trying to look older than his years, Jacob felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Not just purpose, but community. These people were risking everything for justice, for strangers who'd become neighbors through shared humanity. "Whatever happens," Father Brennan said, offering a blessing to the departing riders, "you carry with you the hopes of all decent folk. May the Lord protect you and guide your aim true." "Amen," several voices responded. As they rode out, Jacob caught Naya watching him with those knowing eyes. "What?" he asked. "You're not the same man who rode into town yesterday," she observed. "And neither are you the same woman I found in chains," he replied. "No," she agreed, her hand moving unconsciously to the rifle she'd acquired. "We've both been freed from different kinds of chains. Behind them." Dry Creek continued to buzz with activity as the town grappled with its newfound knowledge of the evil that had flourished in its midst. Ahead lay Canyon Springs in a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of those still enslaved, but the soul of the frontier itself. The sun climbed higher, promising heat and hardship on the trail ahead. But Jacob spurred his horse forward without hesitation. The quiet rancher transformed into something more, a man who'd found his conscience and the courage to act on it, regardless of the cost. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as the posse approached Canyon Springs. They'd ridden hard through the morning, stopping only to water the horses and confirm they were on the right trail. Now, as they crested a rise overlooking the small settlement, Jacob felt his gut tighten at what he saw. Canyon Springs was larger than expected. Not just a way station, but a proper trading post with multiple buildings, corrals, and what looked like a small garrison of armed men. Smoke rose from several chimneys despite the heat, and wagons were arranged in defensive positions around the main compound. "They're ready for trouble," Marshal Tate observed, pulling out a spyglass. "Count at least 20 men visible. Probably more inside." "They knew we were coming," Pete Sullivan spat. "Someone rode ahead and warned them." Naya had dismounted and moved forward on foot, studying the layout with the keen eye of someone raised to read terrain. "There," she pointed to a sturdy building set apart from the others. "Stone walls, barred windows, guards posted. That's where they keep prisoners." "Your father?" Jacob asked quietly. "If he's here." Her voice was steady, but he saw how her hands clenched. "He has to be here." Sheriff Dalton, who'd been silent most of the journey, spoke up. "I know this place. Came here once with Judge Harland, supposed to be about territorial business, but there were locked rooms, guards everywhere. I should have asked questions. Asking questions now counts for something," the marshal said. He turned to address the posse. "We are outnumbered and they have defensive positions. A direct assault would be suicide." "Then what do we do?" Tommy Morrison asked, trying to hide his relief at avoiding an immediate charge. "We use the law," Marshal Tate replied. "I'm a federal officer investigating crimes across territorial boundaries. They can't legally refuse me entry." "You think they care about legal?" Pete Sullivan scoffed. "Maybe not, but it might buy us time, create confusion." The marshal looked at Jacob. "I'll need a small group to ride in with me, official-like. The rest hang back, ready to move if things go bad." "I'm coming," Jacob said immediately. "And me," Naya added. The marshal shook his head. "Miss, they see you and they'll know exactly why we're here." "They already know," she countered. "But seeing me might make some of them think twice. I'm evidence of their crimes walking in plain sight." After a brief argument, the marshal relented. The entry party would consist of himself, Jacob, Naya, Sheriff Dalton, and William Prescott, who still had his clerk's portfolio and could lend an official air to the proceedings. As they rode down toward Canyon Springs, Jacob noticed movement in the buildings. Men taking positions, weapons being readied. His hand stayed near his gun, but he followed the marshal's lead in keeping it holstered. They were met at the compound's entrance by a man who could only be described as dangerous. Tall and lean, with dead eyes and scars that spoke of violence as a profession. He wore 2 guns and moved with a gunfighter's economy. "That's far enough," the man said. "This is private property." Marshal Tate displayed his badge prominently. "Federal business, I need to speak with whoever's in charge." "That would be Mr. Constantine," the gunman replied. "And he ain't receiving visitors?" "He'll receive me," the marshal said firmly. "Unless he wants the army paying a visit instead. I'm investigating reports of illegal trafficking across territorial lines. Cooperation now might save considerable unpleasantness later." The gunman's eyes flicked to Naya, recognition flashing across his face. He knew exactly who she was. After a long moment, he stepped aside. "Wait here." They dismounted under the watchful eyes of numerous guards. Jacob counted positions, memorized faces, noted potential cover. Beside him, Naya stood proud despite the hostile stares, her presence a silent accusation. The gunman returned with another man, shorter, well-dressed, with the soft look of someone who preferred ordering violence to committing it. This had to be Constantine. "Marshal," Constantine's voice was cultured, Eastern. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. We run a legitimate trading post here." "Then you won't mind if we look around," Marshal Tate replied. "Verify there's no truth to these trafficking allegations." "I would mind very much. You have no warrant, no jurisdiction." "Actually," Prescott interrupted, his voice squeaking slightly before he steadied it, "the marshal has full authority under the Federal Anti-Peonage Act of 1867 to investigate any suspected involuntary servitude." Constantine's eyes narrowed. "And who might you be?" "William Prescott, Territorial Legal Clerk." Prescott managed. "I have all the relevant statutes here if you'd care to review them." It was a bluff. Prescott was making up half the legal citations, but it sounded official enough to create uncertainty. "This is highly irregular," Constantine said. "I'll need to consult with my own legal advisors." "You do that," Marshal Tate said. "We'll wait, right here, in full view of your entire operation." It was a clever move. Every minute they stood there, openly displaying the federal badge, was a minute Constantine's men had to think about the consequences of resisting federal authority. Jacob saw doubt creeping into some faces. Then Naya spoke, her voice carrying clearly across the compound. "I am looking for my father, Black Elk of the Northern Shoshone. He was brought here to be sold. I offer myself in trade for his freedom." The words fell like stones into still water. Several guards shifted uncomfortably. Trading in Native Americans was one thing when they were nameless captives. It was another when faced with a daughter seeking her father. "I don't know what you're talking about," Constantine said, but his denial came too quickly. "Then you won't mind proving it," Naya challenged. "Show us your holding areas, and if my father isn't here, we'll leave." "This is ridiculous." He was interrupted by a commotion from the stone building Naya had identified earlier. Shouts, the sound of struggle, then a voice raised in what could only be a Shoshone war cry. "Father!" Naya started forward, but Jacob caught her arm. "Wait," he whispered. "Look." The guards were distracted, turning toward the disturbance. Some moved away from their positions. It was the opening they needed. Marshal Tate raised his voice. "Seems like you have a problem. Mr. Constantine, as a federal officer, I'm obligated to investigate any disturbance that might involve persons being held against their will." "Stay where you are," Constantine snarled, but his control was slipping. That's when Sheriff Dalton made his move. "I know you," he said suddenly, pointing at one of the guards. "Ben Hollis. You were wanted for murder in Kansas until you supposedly died in a fire." The guard went white. Others looked at him with new suspicion. Dalton continued, warming to his theme. "And you, Frank Morrison. Didn't recognize you with the beard, but I never forget a face, especially one wanted for stage robbery." "Shut up," Constantine ordered, but the damage was done. His men were realizing that federal attention meant their past crimes might catch up with them. The disturbance in the prison building grew louder. Now they could hear multiple voices raised in protest, the sound of breaking furniture. "The prisoners are rioting," someone shouted. Constantine had to make a choice: maintain the standoff with the marshal or deal with the uprising. He chose wrong. "He handle the marshal," he told his gunfighter lieutenant. "I'll deal with the prisoners." As Constantine hurried toward the prison building with several men, the gunfighter faced Marshal Tate. "You're leaving? Now?" "I don't think so," the marshal replied calmly. The gunfighter's hand moved toward his weapon, not drawing, just threatening. It was the wrong move. Jacob had been watching, waiting, and his hand was already moving. His gun cleared leather with the smooth speed of long practice, aimed steady at the gunfighter's chest. "Don't," Jacob said quietly. For a moment, everything balanced on a knife's edge. Then Naya shattered the tension by breaking free and running toward the prison building, shouting her father's name in Shoshone. "Stop her!" the gunfighter ordered, momentarily distracted. It was enough. Marshal Tate drew his own weapon, as did Sheriff Dalton. Prescott, surprising everyone, pulled a small derringer from his portfolio. "Federal officers," Marshal Tate bellowed. "Everyone stand down, weapons on the ground." Some guards complied immediately, those with the most to lose from federal investigation. Others hesitated, looking between Constantine's lieutenant and the marshal's party. Then the posse appeared on the ridge, Pete Sullivan, Tommy Morrison, and the others, spreading out in a show of force. They were still outnumbered, but the psychological impact was significant. "It's over," Jacob told the gunfighter. "Your boss is finished. Question is whether you go down with him." The gunfighter's dead eyes calculated odds. Then, slowly, he raised his hands. "I just work here." As guards began dropping weapons, Jacob sprinted after Naya. He found her at the prison building where Constantine was screaming orders at men trying to contain the riot inside. "Open the door," Naya demanded. "Get her out of here," Constantine ordered, but his men hesitated, unwilling to manhandle a woman with federal officers watching. Then the door burst open from inside. A tall Shoshone warrior emerged, bloodied but unbowed, a broken chair leg in his hands as a weapon. His eyes found Naya immediately. "Daughter," Black Elk said simply, as if they'd merely been separated for a day rather than weeks of captivity. "Father," Naya replied, and the relief in her voice made Jacob's throat tight. Behind Black Elk came others, Native Americans of various tribes, Mexican laborers, even some Chinese workers, all bearing signs of harsh treatment but now fired with the hope of freedom. Constantine backed away, his hand moving to a hidden pistol. Jacob saw the motion and reacted, tackling the man before he could draw. They went down hard, rolling in the dust. Constantine was soft but desperate, fighting with the fury of a man seeing his empire crumble. Jacob ended it with a solid punch that left Constantine dazed on the ground. When he looked up, Black Elk was standing over them, the chair leg raised. "No," Jacob said quickly, "and he'll face justice, real justice." Black Elk studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You are the one who freed my daughter." "She freed herself," Jacob replied. "I just helped a little." Hey, someone shouted. "They're trying to burn the records." Smoke was rising from the main building, Prescott, showing more courage than anyone expected, charged toward it with several others. They emerged minutes later with armfuls of documents, bills of sale, correspondence, financial records. "Oh, got them," Prescott called triumphantly. "Names, dates, locations. This goes all the way to San Francisco and beyond." As Constantine and his key men were rounded up, Marshal Tate organized the scene. The freed prisoners were gathered, their names and stories recorded. Medical attention was provided by a doctor among the posse. The compound's weapons were secured. "This is bigger than we thought," the marshal told Jacob privately. "These documents, there are judges, territorial officials, even some army officers involved. This is going to shake things up all the way to Washington." "He good?" Jacob said firmly, "to let it shake." As the sun began to set, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, the long process of getting everyone back to Dry Creek began. The freed prisoners would need care, food, and eventually help returning to their homes. The captured criminals would face trial. The documents would launch investigations across multiple territories. Jacob found himself riding beside Naya and her father. Black Elk, despite his ordeal, sat his horse with natural dignity. He'd said little, but his eyes missed nothing. "You risked much for strangers," Black Elk finally said to Jacob. "They stopped being strangers when I saw the chains," Jacob replied. Black Elk nodded slowly. "You have the heart of a warrior. This is good. My daughter will need such a man." "Father," Naya protested, but there was a slight smile on her lips. Jacob felt heat rise in his face, but managed to keep his voice steady. "I think your daughter has proven she can take care of herself." "This is true," Black Elk agreed. "But even the strongest warrior benefits from someone watching their back." As they rode toward Dry Creek, Jacob reflected on how much had changed in just 2 days. He'd come to town as a quiet rancher seeking supplies. He was returning as part of something larger, a community that had found its conscience, a fight against injustice that would have far-reaching consequences. The stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, and beside him, Naya rode in companionable silence, her presence a reminder that sometimes the most important battles were the ones you didn't plan to fight but couldn't walk away from. The quiet rancher was quiet no more, and somehow, that felt exactly right. The return to Dry Creek with the freed prisoners and captured criminals created an immediate crisis. As the long procession entered the main street, townspeople poured out of buildings, their reactions ranging from shock to anger to guilty silence. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows, giving the scene an almost theatrical quality. Jacob helped organize the freed prisoners near the church while Marshal Tate secured the criminals in the jail. But it quickly became clear that the town's small jail couldn't hold all the captured gang members. And the church, despite Father Brennan's best efforts, was overwhelmed by the number of people needing care. "We need more space," Doc Rourke said, his sleeves rolled up and stained with blood from treating injuries. "And more supplies. These people have been starved, beaten, worked nearly to death." "The town hall," Mrs. Worthington suggested. "It's empty most of the time anyway." "Now hold on." Mayor Cornelius Blackwood, a portly man who'd made his fortune in dry goods, pushed through the crowd. "The town hall is for civic purposes, not for housing. These people," Naya said coldly, supporting an elderly Mexican woman who could barely stand, "are human beings who were enslaved by members of this community." "Alleged members," the mayor corrected, "and we don't know the whole story yet." "We know enough," Father Brennan said firmly. "Boyd Mathers, Judge Harland, and who knows how many others profited from human misery. The least we can do is provide temporary shelter." The crowd began to divide. On one side stood those horrified by the revelations, ready to help. On the other gathered those who'd benefited from the corrupt system or simply resented the disruption to their comfortable lives. "This is going to tear the town apart," banker Harrison Wells declared. "Our reputation, our business relationships. Our reputation was built on slavery." Young Tommy Morrison interrupted, surprising everyone with his boldness. "Maybe it deserves to be torn down." His words sparked angry muttering from some quarters. Jacob noticed several men slipping away, including Claude Ricketts, who ran the freight company, and Josiah Stern, who owned the largest ranch in the valley. Both had been notably absent during the rescue efforts. Black Elk, despite his ordeal, stood tall as he addressed the crowd in accented but clear English. "We did not ask to be brought here. We did not ask to be chained and sold. But now that our suffering is known, you must choose. Stand with justice or with those who profit from injustice." "Fine words," someone shouted from the back. "But who's going to feed all these people? Who's going to pay for their care?" "I will," an unexpected voice said. Everyone turned to see Margaret Spencer, the wealthy widow who owned the largest hotel in town. She rarely involved herself in civic matters, preferring to manage her businesses from behind the scenes. "The Spencer Hotel will provide rooms for families with children," she announced. "And my restaurant will provide meals." "Margaret, think about your paying guests," Mayor Blackwood started. "I am thinking," she replied sharply. "I'm thinking about what my late husband would say if he knew I stood by while people suffered. He came west to build something better, not to recreate the evils of the past." Her declaration sparked others. The general store owner offered supplies. The livery stable provided space for those who couldn't fit elsewhere, but for every person who stepped forward to help, another withdrew, muttering about outside agitators and disturbing the peace. As evening fell, Marshal Tate called a town meeting. The hall was packed, the air thick with tension and the smell of too many bodies in too small a space. Jacob stood near the back with Naya and her father, watching the crowd's mood shift like weather on the plains. "Folks," the marshal began, "what we've uncovered here goes beyond Dry Creek. The documents we seized show a network spanning 3 territories, possibly more. There are going to be federal investigators, trials, upheaval." "Then why bring it to our door?" shouted Ricketts, the freight company owner. "We were doing fine before you stirred things up." "Were we?" Doc Rourke stood up. "Were we fine when people were being bought and sold in our midst? When our neighbors were profiting from slavery?" "It wasn't slavery," someone protested. "It was contracted labor, legal under territorial law." "Illegal don't make it right," Pete Sullivan growled. "And those contracts were forged anyway." Prosecutor Fletcher, who'd been reviewing the seized documents, stood up. "I can confirm that many of the contracts bear forged seals, but more disturbing is what else these papers reveal. There are bills of sale for human beings. Correspondence discussing merchandise that clearly refers to people. Records of bribes to territorial officials." He held up a ledger. "This shows payments from the syndicate to at least a dozen businesses in Dry Creek. The corruption runs deep." The room erupted. Those named or implicated shouted denials. Others demanded immediate arrests. Fistfights broke out until Marshal Tate fired his pistol into the ceiling, restoring order. "Enough," he commanded. "There will be due process, investigations, trials. But right now, we need to focus on the immediate problem, caring for the freed prisoners and maintaining order." "What about our businesses?" Banker Wells demanded. "If word spreads about this, Dry Creek will be ruined. No one will trade with us, and the railroad might even bypass us entirely." "He better to be bypassed than to be damned," Father Brennan said quietly. but his words carried. It was then that Naya stood up. Despite her exhaustion and injuries, she commanded attention. You worry about your businesses, your reputation. We worry about our families torn apart, our people sold like cattle. Which concern weighs more in the scales of justice? That's all well and good, Mayor Blackwood said. But sentiment doesn't pay bills or put food on tables. Neither does slavery, Jacob heard himself say, stepping forward. At least not honest food on honest tables. He found himself the focus of dozens of eyes. The quiet rancher who'd kept to himself for years, now standing before the entire town. I've been in Dry Creek for 15 years, he continued. Kept my head down, minded my own business, told myself that was the smart way to live. But these past days have shown me the cost of that silence. Evil flourished because good people like me, chose comfort over conscience. He looked around the room, meeting eyes that quickly looked away. We can choose differently now. We can be a town that faced its sins and made amends, or we can be a footnote in history, remembered only for our shame. Pretty words from a man who can afford principles, Ricketts sneered. Some of us have families to feed, workers to pay. Workers you underpaid because you could always threaten to replace them with slave labor? Sheriff Dalton spoke up unexpectedly. He'd been sitting quietly, but now stood, his former badge in his hand. I helped enable this system. Looked the other way because it was easier, because I was afraid, but I'm done with that fear. He walked to Marshall Tate and held out the badge. I resign my position formally, but I volunteer to help however I can in making things right. His actions seemed to break something loose in the crowd. Sarah Miller, who ran the boarding house, stood up. I knew something was wrong. Saw people brought through town at night. But I kept quiet because Boyd Mathers held the mortgage on my property. One by one, confessions and revelations emerged. The barber had cut hair for prisoners before they were presented to buyers. The blacksmith had made chains and shackles, telling himself they were for livestock. The seamstress had mended clothes for people she never saw again. This whole town is complicit, Mrs. Worthington said sadly. Whether through action or silence, we all bear responsibility. Then the whole town can work to make amends, Marshall Tate said. Starting now. But the opposition wasn't ready to yield. Josiah Stern, the big rancher, stood up with several of his men behind him. This is federal overreach, plain and simple. The marshal has no right to dictate to free citizens. I say we form a committee of leading citizens to handle this matter locally. The leading citizens like Judge Harland? Jacob asked. Or Boyd Mathers? Your leading citizens are the ones who created this problem. Stern's face reddened. You've gone too far. Hale, you and these outside agitators, stirring up trouble where none existed. No trouble except for the enslaved people, Naya said coldly. Indian troublemakers, one of Stern's men muttered, loud enough to be heard. Black Elk moved faster than seemed possible for a man who'd been imprisoned. He was across the room, the cowboy on the ground, before anyone could react. Speak of my daughter with respect, he said calmly. Or don't speak at all. Stern's men reached for their guns but found themselves facing the weapons of Pete Sullivan, Tommy Morrison, and others who'd ridden with the rescue party. A gentleman, Marshall Tate said mildly, though his hand rested on his pistol. Let's keep this civilized. Mr. Stern, you and your men can leave if you find the proceedings not to your taste. This isn't over, Stern warned. The territorial governor will hear about this. You've overstepped your authority. Marshal? The governor already knows, Prosecutor Fletcher said. In fact, he's the one who authorized the investigation. Would you like to see his sealed orders? Stern's bluster deflated slightly. He gestured to his men and they filed out, but not before shooting dark looks at Jacob and the others. As the meeting continued, the town's division became clear. About a third supported immediate action to help the freed prisoners and root out corruption. Another third opposed any action that might hurt business or reveal their own complicity. The remaining third wavered, wanting to do right but fearing the consequences. "We need a new mayor," someone suggested. "Blackwood's too compromised." "And a new sheriff," another added. "Elections can wait," Marshal Tate said. "Right now, we need food, medical care, and temporary housing for 67 people. We need statements from witnesses. We need to secure evidence, and we need to prepare for the backlash that's surely coming." "What kind of backlash?" Tommy Morrison asked nervously. "The syndicate won't take this quietly," the marshal explained. "They've lost a major operation, seen key members arrested. They might try to silence witnesses, destroy evidence, or simply exact revenge. Then we'd better organize our own defense," Jacob said. "Form a citizens committee, post guards, establish patrols." "A vigilante justice?" Mayor Blackwood protested. "Then that's not the answer." "Neither is leaving these people defenseless," Jacob countered. "We're not talking about lynching anyone. We're talking about protecting witnesses and maintaining order until proper authority can be established." Father Brennan stood up. "I propose we form a committee of safety and reconciliation. Its purpose would be threefold: protect the freed prisoners and witnesses, assist Marshal Tate in his investigation, and begin the work of making amends for our town's sins." "Who would serve on this committee?" Mrs. Worthington asked. "Those who've shown courage," Black Elk suggested. "The rancher who broke chains, the priest who opened his church, the doctor who heals without asking payment, the woman who speaks truth when others are silent." His words carried weight. When volunteers were called for, enough stepped forward to form a functioning committee. Jacob found himself nominated to chair it, with Mrs. Worthington as secretary and Doc Rourke as treasurer. As the meeting broke up, Naya approached Jacob. "You spoke well, but words are easier than actions." "I know," Jacob replied. "That's why I plan to back them up." "How?" "For starters, I'm hiring any of the freed prisoners who want work at my ranch. Fair wages, decent housing. It's not much, but it's a beginning." She studied him with those penetrating eyes. "And when the syndicate comes for revenge, when your neighbors turn against you, then I'll face that when it comes," Jacob said simply. "I'm done running from hard choices." Black Elk had been listening. "You have changed, quiet rancher. The man who rode into town would not have said such things. The man who rode into town hadn't met your daughter," Jacob admitted, then flushed at his own boldness. A ghost of a smile crossed Black Elk's weathered face. "Perhaps some changes are for the good." As they left the town hall, the divisions were visible in the street. Groups clustered together, voices raised in argument. Some businesses had closed their doors to anyone associated with the rescue. Others displayed hastily made signs welcoming all. "It's going to get worse before it gets better," Marshal Tate observed, joining them. "Word's already spreading to other towns. By tomorrow, we'll have journalists, investigators, maybe even syndicate enforcement." "Then we'd better be ready," Jacob said. As the moon rose over Dry Creek, casting the divided town in silver light, the freed prisoners settled into their temporary quarters. Guards were posted, patrols organized. The work of justice and reconciliation had begun. But in the shadows, those who profited from the old system plotted their response. The battle for Dry Creek's soul was far from over. If anything, it had just begun. Dawn came like a knife edge across the desert, bringing with it the sound of thundering hooves. "Jacob," who'd been keeping watch from the church bell tower, spotted the dust cloud first. "Riders coming," he called down. "Lots of them." The town, already on edge from a sleepless night, erupted into controlled chaos. The Committee of Safety had organized well. Armed citizens took defensive positions while others hustled the freed prisoners to secure locations. But as the riders drew closer, Jacob lowered his rifle. "Stand down, it's military." A full cavalry company rode into Dry Creek, guidons snapping in the morning breeze. At their head rode Captain Samuel Morrison, crisp in his blue uniform despite the dust of hard travel. Behind the soldiers came several civilian riders, including what appeared to be government officials. Marshal Tate met them in the street. Captain Morrison didn't expect Army involvement this soon. "A marshal," the captain touched his hat brim. "We've been tracking syndicate operations for months. When word reached Fort Bridger about your raid on Canyon Springs, we were ordered to provide support." One of the civilians dismounted, a thin, severe-looking man in a black suit. "Agent Pinkerton, Treasury Department," he introduced himself. "We need to speak privately. What you've uncovered is bigger than you know." They convened in the town hall. Marshal Tate, Captain Morrison, Agent Pinkerton, Jacob, and several committee members. Naya insisted on attending with Black Elk beside her. Pinkerton spread documents on the table. "The syndicate you've exposed is part of an international operation. They traffic not just in forced labor but in weapons, stolen goods, and information. These aren't simple criminals. They have connections in Washington, London, even Moscow." "Moscow," Mrs. Worthington said incredulously. "The Russian-American company has interests in the fur trade. Native American slaves are valuable in Siberian operations." Pinkerton's voice was matter-of-fact, but the words sent chills through the room. "My God," Father Brennan crossed himself. "The scope of it—" "That's not all," Captain Morrison added. "We intercepted a telegram yesterday. The syndicate has put bounties on everyone involved in the Canyon Springs raid. Professional killers are already en route." "How much?" Pete Sullivan asked with grim humor. "Like to know what I'm worth." "5,000 for Marshal Tate, 3,000 for Mr. Hale." The captain's eyes found Naya. 10,000 for Chief Black Elk and his daughter, alive." The room went silent. $10,000 was more money than most would see in a lifetime. "Why them specifically?" Jacob demanded. Agent Pinkerton answered. "Black Elk witnessed a meeting 6 months ago between syndicate leaders and foreign buyers. He can identify people we've been tracking for years. His testimony could bring down the entire network." "I saw them," Black Elk confirmed. "Men in fine clothes discussing the sale of my people like cattle. I remember faces, names spoken, maps examined." "Then we need to get you to safety," Marshal Tate said. "Both of you." "No," Naya said firmly. "We don't run, not anymore." "Daughter speaks truth," Black Elk added. "Running only delays justice." Agent Pinkerton leaned forward. "There's more. We have reason to believe someone in this room is still working for the syndicate." The accusation fell like a hammer blow. Everyone looked at everyone else with sudden suspicion. "That's impossible," Jacob said. "Everyone here risked their lives. The best cover is active participation." Pinkerton interrupted. "Someone's been sending information out. The syndicate knew about your plans, your numbers, even your route to Canyon Springs. Only someone in the inner circle could have provided such detail." "I can vouch for my men," Captain Morrison said. "They're all vetted." "Then it's one of us," Mrs. Worthington said quietly. "One of the townspeople." The meeting devolved into accusations and denials. Old grievances surfaced. Tommy Morrison accused banker Wells of profiting from syndicate money. Wells countered that the Morrison family had transported suspicious cargo. Even Doc Rourke came under suspicion for treating syndicate members without questions. "Stop!" Naya's voice cut through the chaos. "This is what they want, us turning on each other." "Miss Naya's right," Marshal Tate agreed. "We need proof, not suspicions." "Then let's get it," Agent Pinkerton said. "I propose we set a trap, feed different information to different people, see what reaches the syndicate." As they planned, a commotion arose outside. Jacob went to the window and cursed, "Journalists. Looks like word spread." Indeed, several riders with the unmistakable look of newspaper men were setting up in the street. Within hours, Dry Creek would be famous, or infamous, across the territory. The meeting broke up with plans to reconvene that evening. As people dispersed, Jacob noticed William Prescott lingering, nervous as always. "Something on your mind, William?" The clerk glanced around, then whispered, "I need to show you something, not here, too many eyes." They met an hour later in the abandoned assay office at the edge of town. Prescott had a leather satchel clutched to his chest. "I didn't want to say anything in front of the others," he began. "But when I was copying documents at Canyon Springs, I found these." He pulled out several papers. "They're in code, but I recognized some patterns from my work with Judge Harland." Jacob studied the documents. They appeared to be shipping manifests, but the cargo descriptions made no sense unless they were code for people. "Look at this." Prescott pointed to a notation. 20 units of Type 7. Judge Harlan once let slip that Type 7 meant young women. And here, special collection for Eastern buyer. That's code for specific individuals targeted for capture. "This is evidence of planning organization," Jacob said, "but can you decode more?" "Given time, but Mr. Hale, there's something else." Prescott's voice dropped. "I recognize the handwriting on some margin notes. It's someone we know, someone trusted." Before he could say more, the door burst open. 3 men entered, guns drawn, not townspeople. Their clothes and manner marked them as professionals. "Well, well," the leader said. "The nervous clerk and the noble rancher, how convenient." Jacob's hand moved toward his gun, but froze as more men appeared at the windows. They were surrounded. "You're worth more alive," the leader continued, "but dead's acceptable if you make trouble." "You're making a mistake," Jacob said calmly. "The army's in town. You won't get far. The army's dealing with a fire at the livery stable. Amazing how fast hay burns." The man smiled coldly. "Now, you're coming with us. Both of you." Prescott whimpered, but Jacob saw him subtly tuck the decoded documents inside his shirt. The clerk had more courage than appeared. They were marched out through the back, where horses waited. The kidnappers were professional, no wasted motion, no unnecessary talk. As they mounted up, Jacob caught a glimpse of smoke rising from the direction of the livery stable. The distraction had worked perfectly, but as they rode out of town, Jacob heard something that gave him hope, a Shoshone war cry, followed by gunshots. The kidnapping hadn't gone unnoticed after all. The chase that followed was brutal. The kidnappers knew the terrain, but so did their pursuers. Jacob caught glimpses of riders behind them, army blue mixed with civilian clothes, and leading them, unmistakably, was Naya on her paint horse, riding like vengeance itself. The running fight covered miles of desert and rocky terrain. Prescott, unused to hard riding, barely stayed in the saddle. Jacob watched for an opportunity, any chance to turn the tables. It came at Devil's Canyon, a narrow defile with steep walls. The kidnappers had to slow down, riding single file. That's when Jacob heard it, the distinctive whistle of a Shoshone arrow. The rear kidnapper toppled from his saddle. Another arrow took the next man. The leader spun around, realizing the trap too late. Black Elk and his warriors had gotten ahead somehow, positioned perfectly for ambush. "A down!" Jacob yelled to Prescott, diving from his horse as gunfire erupted. The battle was brief but vicious, caught between Shoshone arrows from above and cavalry carbines from behind. The kidnappers had no chance. Within minutes, it was over. Jacob found himself looking up at Naya, who'd slid down the canyon wall like a mountain cat. "You're late," he said. "You're predictable," she countered, but relief flickered in her eyes. "Always trying to protect others, never watching your own back." Captain Morrison arrived with his troopers, surveying the scene. "Any alive?" "2," Black Elk reported. "Then they may talk, given encouragement." "We'll handle the interrogation properly," the captain said firmly. "By the book," as they gathered the evidence from the dead kidnappers' belongings. Prescott pulled out the documents he'd hidden. "These prove the conspiracy," he said. "But there's more. I know who the traitor is." Everyone leaned in as he explained. "The handwriting in the margins, it's someone who's been documenting everything, someone with access to all our plans." Who?" Marshal Tate demanded. Prescott's face was pale but determined. "Samuel Fletcher, the prosecutor." The revelation stunned everyone. Fletcher had seemed so dedicated to justice, so helpful in exposing corruption. "And think about it," Prescott continued. "He appeared just when we needed legal authority. He had access to all the evidence, knew all our plans, and he's the one who suggested splitting up our forces this morning." "The fire," Captain Morrison said grimly. "He knew it would draw us away." They raced back to town to find chaos. The fire had spread beyond the livery stable. Fletcher was nowhere to be found, but his office had been ransacked, or perhaps carefully cleaned of incriminating evidence. "He's running," Agent Pinkerton said, "but he won't get far. I've already telegraphed surrounding towns." In Fletcher's abandoned rooms, they found the final pieces of the puzzle: maps marking syndicate routes, lists of contacts, and most damning, a journal documenting his infiltration of the territorial government. He was planning this for years, Mrs. Worthington said, reading through the journal. Gaining positions of trust, learning who could be corrupted, who needed to be eliminated. "The merchant who died," Doc Rourke said suddenly. "Fletcher was the one who suggested he investigate the missing people. Led him right to his death." As night fell, the town struggled to process this new betrayal. The man they'd trusted to prosecute the criminals had been the biggest criminal of all, but there was no time for despair. Agent Pinkerton had decoded more of the syndicate communications. "There's a major buyer coming, someone they call the Collector. He's interested specifically in Native American artifacts and specimens." "Specimens?" Father Brennan asked, though his face showed he understood. "People," Black Elk said flatly. "They mean people, to be displayed like curiosities in Eastern mansions or European museums." "When?" Jacob asked. 3 days. Meeting location is the old Fort Defiance ruins." Pinkerton looked around the room. "This is our chance. If we can capture the Collector and his contacts, we can trace the network all the way to its source." "It's also a trap," Captain Morrison warned. "They'll be expecting us now." "And then we give them what they expect," Naya said, "but not how they expect it." As plans took shape for the final confrontation, Jacob found himself alone with Naya on the church steps. The town was quieter now, exhausted by revelations and betrayals. "Your father was right," Naya said quietly. "You're not the same man who rode into town." "Neither are you the woman in chains," Jacob replied. "Though you were never really her, were you? That was just the surface. We all wear chains," Naya said, "some visible, some not. Yours were made of silence and isolation. And now," she looked at him directly, "now you're free." The question is what you'll do with that freedom. Jacob considered. Help build something better, a place where chains have no power. Pretty words, Naya said, but she was almost smiling. Let's see if you can live up to them. Together? Jacob asked. Perhaps, she allowed, if you survive the next 3 days. As they sat in comfortable silence, the stars emerged overhead. Somewhere in the darkness, Fletcher was running. The collector was approaching. The syndicate was preparing its response. But for this moment, two people who'd found each other in the worst of circumstances allowed themselves to imagine a better future. The greatest truth had been revealed, not just the corruption that had infected the territory, but the power of ordinary people to stand against it. The final battle was coming, but they would face it together. The ruins of Fort Defiance stood like broken teeth against the dawn sky, 30 miles south of Dry Creek. Jacob studied the layout through field glasses, noting defensive positions and escape routes. Beside him, Captain Morrison and Marshal Tate made their own assessments. They've chosen well, the captain said. High ground, clear fields of fire, multiple exits through the canyon system. How many? Jacob asked. Our scouts count at least 40 men already in position. Black Elk reported, materializing from the rocks like a ghost. More arriving from the south. They prepare for war. The combined force hidden in the surrounding ridges was impressive. Cavalry troops, townspeople volunteers, and 30 Shoshone warriors led by Black Elk. But they were still outnumbered, and the enemy held the superior position. The collector arrives at noon, Agent Pinkerton informed them, checking his pocket watch. According to the intelligence we've gathered, he travels with a private army, European mercenaries mostly. European, Pete Sullivan spat tobacco juice. What's their interest in our troubles? Money, Pinkerton said simply. And worse, there's a market among certain wealthy collectors for exotic specimens. Native Americans are particularly prized. The disgust on everyone's faces was palpable. Even hardened soldiers looked sickened. Where's the girl? Captain Morrison asked, looking around. Naya is positioned with the sharpshooters, Jacob said, trying not to let worry color his voice. She'd insisted on taking one of the most dangerous positions, covering the main approach. And Fletcher? No sign, Marshal Tate admitted. But I'd bet my badge he's down there somewhere. This is too big for him to miss. As the sun climbed higher, more riders appeared at the fort. Through the field glasses, Jacob recognized some faces: Josiah Stern, the rancher who'd opposed them in town, Claude Ricketts with several of his freight wagons, and others who'd slipped away when the truth came out. Look there, Mrs. Worthington pointed. She'd insisted on coming, now serving as field medic alongside Doc Rourke. Those wagons are reinforced, built for transporting people. Prison wagons, Black Elk said grimly. I have seen such before. At 11:30, a dust cloud appeared from the east. The collector's party was arriving early, a bad sign that suggested confidence or inside information. The procession that entered Fort Defiance was like something from another world. Fine carriages unsuited to rough terrain, guards in uniform rather than frontier clothes, and at the center, a large black coach with curtained windows. That's him, Pinkerton confirmed. Count Dmitry Volkonsky, officially a cultural attaché, actually one of the biggest human traffickers in the Americas. A count, Tommy Morrison whispered. A real European nobleman? The worst kind, Pinkerton said. One who thinks his bloodline gives him the right to own others. The coach stopped in the fort's courtyard. A tall, elegant man emerged, silver hair, immaculate despite the journey, carrying a cane that was clearly decorative rather than necessary. He surveyed the fort like a man inspecting property he already owned. Through the field glasses, Jacob saw Fletcher emerge from one of the buildings. The prosecutor-turned-traitor looked haggard, desperate. He gestured animatedly as he spoke to the Count, clearly agitated. "He's warning them," Captain Morrison said, "on telling them about our forces." But the Count merely waved dismissively, his arrogance evident even at distance. He gestured to his men, who began unloading crates from the wagons. "Payment," Black Elk observed. "Gold and weapons." "For how many lives?" Father Brennan murmured, making the sign of the cross. The waiting was agony. They needed the meeting to fully commence, to catch as many conspirators as possible. But every minute increased the risk of discovery. Then disaster struck. One of the younger townspeople, nervous and inexperienced, shifted position and dislodged a rock. It clattered down the slope, the sound carrying clearly in the still air. Every head in the fort turned toward their position. "Damn," Marshal Tate cursed. "So much for surprise." The fort erupted into motion. Men ran for defensive positions while the Count retreated toward his coach. But before he could reach it, a shot rang out, Naya's rifle, and the coach driver toppled from his seat. "Attack!" Captain Morrison commanded. The cavalry charged from 3 directions while Shoshone arrows rained from the heights. The syndicate forces, caught between military discipline and native warrior fury, began to falter despite their superior position. Jacob led a group of townspeople down a goat track he'd spotted, flanking the main gate. They met fierce resistance. These weren't ordinary criminals but trained fighters. The battle became a series of desperate close-quarter fights among the ruins. Through the chaos, Jacob saw Fletcher trying to escape through a gap in the walls. Without thinking, he gave chase, leaving the main battle behind. The pursuit led through crumbling corridors and collapsed rooms. Fletcher always just ahead, surprisingly agile for a man of law books and papers. They emerged in what had been the fort's chapel, now roofless and open to the sky. Fletcher spun around, a derringer in his hand. "You should have minded your own business, Hale," he snarled. "Everything was working perfectly until you decided to play hero." "People were suffering," Jacob said, hand hovering near his gun. "People always suffer. The only question is whether you profit from it or not." Fletcher's cultured voice cracked with strain. "Do you know what they offered me? Wealth, power, position. All I had to do was look the other way. And when looking away wasn't enough," Fletcher's laugh was bitter, "then you do more, always more, until you're in so deep that the only way out is through." His finger tightened on the trigger. "Goodbye, Hale." The derringer cracked, but Jacob was already moving. The bullet tugged at his shirt as he dove aside, his own gun clearing leather. But before he could fire, an arrow sprouted from Fletcher's shoulder, spinning him around. Naya stood in the doorway, another arrow already knocked. "You talk too much," she told Fletcher. The former prosecutor dropped his weapon, clutching his wounded shoulder. "It's not over," he gasped. "The syndicate has roots everywhere. You've only cut one branch." "Then we'll cut them all," Jacob said, securing Fletcher's hands. "One at a time, if necessary." They emerged to find the battle largely won. The Count's mercenaries, faced with determined opposition, had surrendered. Syndicate members were being rounded up. But the Count himself was nowhere to be seen. "He escaped during the fighting," Captain Morrison reported, frustration evident. "Took a fast horse and headed into the canyon lands. We've got patrols searching, but—" "He won't get far," Black Elk said with quiet confidence. "My warriors know these lands. They will find him." As the prisoners were secured and evidence gathered, the full scope of the operation became clear. Documents in the Count's abandoned coach revealed a network spanning from Alaska to Mexico, with connections to European capitals and Asian ports. The numbers were staggering, Thousands of people trafficked, millions in profits, corruption at every level of society. This will take years to fully unravel, Agent Pinkerton said, reviewing the papers. But it's a start, a good start. As the sun began to set, painting the ruins in shades of gold and red, a Shoshone warrior returned. He spoke quietly to Black Elk, who nodded grimly. "The Count?" Jacob asked. "Found. He chose to fight rather than surrender." Black Elk's expression suggested the Count's choice had been particularly unwise. "His trafficking days are ended." Some might have called for the body for proof, but Marshal Tate simply nodded. "Mountain justice," he said. "Sometimes it's the only kind that fits." The journey back to Dry Creek was subdued despite the victory. Too many had died. Too much had been revealed about the darkness lurking beneath civilization's veneer. But there was also a sense of accomplishment, of a job well done against overwhelming odds. The town that greeted them was transformed. News of the victory had preceded them, and the streets were lined with people, some cheering, others silent with shame or resentment. The divisions remained, but the balance had shifted decisively toward justice. At the jail, they were met by Prosecutor Hopkins from the territorial capital, a man whose reputation for honesty had been verified by Pinkerton's agents. "Mr. Fletcher," Hopkins said coldly to his predecessor, "you'll be interested to know we've frozen all syndicate assets in the territory. That includes the accounts you thought were so well hidden." Fletcher's face went ashen. Without his ill-gotten wealth, he was just another criminal facing the gallows. As the prisoners were processed and statements taken, Jacob found himself standing with Naya outside the church. The freed prisoners had gathered there, preparing for the journey home now that their captors were defeated. "Your father leaves tomorrow?" Jacob asked. "With those who wish to return to our lands," Naya confirmed. "But some choose to stay. The Morrison family has offered work to several. Mrs. Spencer is hiring others for her hotel. And you?" She was quiet for a long moment. "I have been thinking. There is work still to be done. Other towns with similar secrets, other people in chains." "That sounds like a purpose," Jacob said carefully. "One that might require help," she admitted. "Someone who knows how to read the silences, how to see what others overlook. A quiet rancher, perhaps. One who's learned when not to be quiet." She turned to face him fully. "My father approves, if that matters." "Does it?" "Less than what I think," Naya said. "And I think we make a good team." Before Jacob could respond, Marshal Tate approached. "Hate to interrupt, but thought you should know Washington's taking notice. There's talk of a new federal task force to combat trafficking. They'll need experienced people." "Experienced at what?" Jacob asked. "Breaking chains," the marshal said simply. "All kinds of chains." As night fell over Dry Creek, the town began the slow work of healing. Some businesses would fail without syndicate money. Some citizens would leave rather than face their shame, but others would stay and build something better. In the church, Father Brennan held a service of reconciliation. Former enemies sat in the same pews. Apologies were offered. Some accepted. Others met with silence that spoke of wounds too fresh to heal. "It's not enough," Mrs. Worthington said to Jacob afterward. "After what was done, how can it ever be enough?" "It's not," Jacob agreed, "but it's a beginning, and beginnings matter." William Prescott, hero despite himself, had been offered a position with the territorial government. "They need honest clerks," he said, still nervous but standing straighter than before. Imagine that. Pete Sullivan and Tommy Morrison were organizing a citizens' watch to prevent future corruption. Doc Rourke was establishing a clinic that would serve all, regardless of ability to pay. "You did this," Naya told Jacob as they walked through the transformed town. You broke the first chain. We did this, Jacob corrected. All of us, even those who joined late, found their courage. And now? Now we see what we can build on the ruins of what we've torn down. They stood together in the street where it all began, where a quiet rancher had seen a woman in chains and chosen to act. The stars overhead were the same, but everything else had changed. "And no regrets?" Naya asked. "None," Jacob said firmly. "For the first time in my life, none at all." In the distance, a coyote howled, not a lament but a call to others of its kind. The sound seemed fitting. They had answered their own call, found their own kind, and discovered that courage was contagious when people stood together. The syndicate was broken in this territory, but as Fletcher had said, it had many branches. There would be other fights, other chains to break. But tonight, in this small frontier town, justice had won a victory worth celebrating. And somewhere in the darkness, a quiet rancher and a warrior's daughter planned their next move in a larger game, knowing that some fights were worth dedicating a life to, especially when you didn't have to fight alone. 6 months had passed since the battle at Fort Defiance, and Dry Creek bore little resemblance to the town where Jacob Hale had once encountered a woman in chains. The main street bustled with legitimate commerce. New businesses had opened, and most importantly, people walked with their heads held high rather than averting their eyes from uncomfortable truths. Jacob stood on the porch of the new federal marshal's office, badge glinting in the morning sun. The appointment had come through just last week, Marshal Tate's recommendation carrying significant weight after the syndicate trials. Beside him, Naya sorted through a stack of telegrams, her own deputy's badge a testament to changing times. 3 more reports of suspicious activity, she said, scanning the messages. 1 from Tucson, 2 from the Colorado border. The syndicate's remnants trying to regroup, Jacob observed. They never learn. Or they learn too well, Naya countered. These operations are smaller, more careful, harder to detect. The door opened and William Prescott emerged, now serving as the territorial prosecutor after Hopkins had been appointed to the federal bench. The nervous clerk had become a determined lawman, though he still jumped at sudden noises. "The Patterson trial concludes today," he reported. "With his testimony, we should secure convictions for the remaining defendants." Patterson had been one of the syndicate's bookkeepers, captured trying to burn records during the Fort Defiance raid. His decision to cooperate had provided invaluable intelligence about the network's financial structure. "Any word from Black Elk?" Jacob asked Naya. A smile touched her lips. "Father writes that the tribal council has agreed to establish regular patrols along the traditional routes. Any suspicious trafficking activity will be reported immediately." The alliance between federal law enforcement and the native tribes had been one of the unexpected outcomes of the Dry Creek events. Where once there had been suspicion and hostility, now there was cooperation born of shared purpose. Father Brennan appeared, walking with Mrs. Worthington and Doc Rourke. The 3 had become known as the Conscience Committee, working to help former syndicate victims rebuild their lives. "Marshal Hale," Father Brennan greeted. "We've just received wonderful news. The territorial legislature has passed the Anti-Trafficking Act, making the buying and selling of persons a capital crime," Mrs. Worthington added with satisfaction. "With mandatory sentences for anyone facilitating such trade." "About time," Doc Rourke said, "though I suspect we'll need more than laws to change hearts and minds." "Hearts and minds change one person at a time," Jacob replied. "But laws give us tools to work with while that happens." As they talked, a commotion arose from the direction of the train depot. The railroad had finally reached Dry Creek, another change brought by recent events. The town's reputation for standing against corruption had attracted legitimate investment. Pete Sullivan came riding hard from the depot. Marshall, stagecoach just arrived with a special passenger. Federal judge wanting to see you immediate like. Jacob and Naya exchanged glances. Unscheduled federal visits usually meant trouble. They found Judge Catherine Thornton waiting in the marshal's office, one of the few female federal judges in the territories, appointed by President Grant himself as part of the reform movement sparked by the trafficking revelations. Marshal Hale, Deputy Naya, she greeted formally. I'll be direct. We have a problem. She spread documents on the desk. Samuel Fletcher has been granted a new trial. His lawyers claim procedural errors, coerced testimony, and jurisdictional issues. That's impossible, Prescott protested. We followed every rule. I'm sure you did, Judge Thornton interrupted. But Fletcher has powerful friends and expensive lawyers. They're trying to turn him into a symbol of government overreach. He was caught red-handed, Naya said coldly. His own documents proved his guilt, which his lawyers claim were planted or misinterpreted. The judge's expression showed what she thought of such claims. The new trial is in 3 weeks. We need every witness, every piece of evidence, every detail perfect. One mistake and he walks free. Then we'd better get to work, Jacob said. The next weeks were a whirlwind of preparation. Witnesses were located and prepared. Evidence was meticulously cataloged, and security was arranged for those testifying. The syndicate might be broken, but it still had resources and reach. The trial took place in the territorial capital, in a courthouse packed with spectators and journalists. Fletcher appeared confident, well-dressed, his lawyers a phalanx of Eastern education and aggressive tactics. My client was a dedicated public servant caught up in a witch hunt. The lead defense attorney proclaimed, ambitious federal agents needed a scapegoat for their failure to prevent criminal activity, and they chose a man whose only crime was doing his job too well. The prosecution, led by Prescott with support from federal attorneys, methodically dismantled this narrative. Witness after witness testified to Fletcher's involvement, freed prisoners describing his visits to inspect merchandise, former syndicate members detailing payments made, documents experts confirming the authenticity of incriminating papers. When Naya took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. She spoke clearly and without emotion, describing her capture, imprisonment, and the system that had enabled it. When Fletcher's lawyer tried to discredit her as a savage seeking revenge, she responded with quiet dignity. I seek justice, not revenge. Revenge would be treating Mr. B. Fletcher as he treated us, as property without rights or humanity. Justice is allowing him the fair trial he denied to so many. The moment that sealed Fletcher's fate came when Jacob testified about the chase through Fort Defiance. Fletcher's confession in the ruined chapel. The defense tried to claim Jacob had fabricated the conversation, that no witness could corroborate it. Actually, a voice called from the gallery, I can corroborate it. Everyone turned to see Marshall Tate, recently returned from assignment in California. I was positioned in the rocks above the chapel, providing overwatch. I heard every word. The defense objected furiously, but Judge Thornton allowed the testimony. Tate's word carried enormous weight, his reputation unimpeachable. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours, guilty on all counts. As Fletcher was led away, he paused near Jacob. You think you've won. There will always be people willing to trade in human misery, supply and demand, Marshall, basic economics. Maybe, Jacob agreed, but now they know we're watching, and the price for getting caught just got a lot higher. Fletcher's execution 2 months later was attended by many of his victims. It brought closure to some, though others found that justice, while necessary, couldn't heal all wounds. Back in Dry Creek, life continued its transformation. The freed prisoners who'd chosen to stay had integrated into the community. Some had started businesses, others worked established trades. Tommy Morrison had married the daughter of one of the Mexican families, their wedding a celebration of unity that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. A change happens, Father Brennan observed during his sermon at the wedding. Sometimes slowly, sometimes in great rushes, but always when good people choose courage over comfort. The new federal task force on human trafficking had established its western headquarters in Dry Creek, bringing jobs and prestige to the town. Young lawyers and investigators arrived weekly, eager to be part of the continuing fight. One evening, as Jacob and Naya patrolled the quiet streets, they stopped at the spot where they'd first met, where she'd been chained to a post outside Boyd Mather's saloon. The saloon was gone now, replaced by a school where children of all backgrounds learned together. "Do you ever regret it?" Naya asked. "The quiet life you gave up?" Jacob considered. His ranch was now run by foremen while he pursued lawbreakers across the territory. The solitary life he'd built had been completely overturned. "I wasn't living," he said finally. "I was just existing, avoiding pain by avoiding connection, avoiding wrong by avoiding choice. That's not a life. And now I'm tired most of the time, worried about cases, constantly traveling and dealing with bureaucrats who think they know better than the people on the ground. But I wake up knowing what I do matters. That somewhere, because of our work, someone isn't in chains today who might have been." He looked at her. "And I wake up next to you, which makes even the worst days bearable." They'd married quietly 3 months after Fort Defiance, a ceremony attended by her father and their closest allies. It hadn't been without challenges. Some still couldn't accept a white man and a native woman as partners in law and life. But those voices grew quieter as their record of success grew louder. "A letter came today," Naya said, producing an envelope. "From Washington. They want us to testify before Congress about expanding the task force nationally." "Politicians," Jacob sighed. "They'll talk it to death and water it down until it's useless. Or they'll listen to the people who've actually done the work and create something effective." Naya countered. "We have to try." She was right. Of course, the fight against human trafficking couldn't be won in one town or one territory. It required systematic change, resources, and most importantly, the will to see uncomfortable truths. As they continued their patrol, they encountered Pete Sullivan closing up his new freight company, one that explicitly refused to transport suspicious cargo and had contracts requiring inspection rights. "Evening, Marshal," he greeted. "Quiet night." "The best kind," Jacob replied. "Not too quiet, I hope," Pete grinned. "Bad for the heroic reputation." "The heroes are just ordinary people who couldn't look away," Naya said. "Then Dry Creek is full of heroes now." It was true. The town that had once harbored a slave market now stood as a beacon of justice. Not perfect. Perfection was beyond human reach, but striving always to be better. As midnight approached, they climbed to the church bell tower, a ritual they'd developed to mark the end of each week. From there, they could see the whole town, peaceful, prosperous, and free. "Fletcher was wrong," Naya observed, "about supply and demand. He forgot that conscience can change the equation." "One conscience at a time," Jacob agreed, "until the market for misery disappears entirely." Below them, Dry Creek slept peacefully, its transformation complete but its vigilance eternal. The quiet rancher and the warrior's daughter had helped break the chains of an evil system, but they knew the price of freedom was eternal watchfulness. In the distance, a train whistle announced the late freight heading east, carrying legitimate goods and legal passengers. The sound of honest commerce, of a society choosing justice over easy profit. Ready for Washington? Jacob asked. Ready for whatever comes next, Naya replied. They climbed down from the tower and headed home. Two people who'd found purpose in each other and in the fight for human dignity. Behind them, the bells of Dry Creek chimed midnight, marking the end of one day and the beginning of another. The story that had begun with a moment of conscience, a quiet rancher refusing to ignore a woman in chains, had grown into something larger. A movement, a change in law and culture, a proof that ordinary people could stand against extraordinary evil and win. Not a complete victory. Such things were rare in human affairs. But a beginning, a foundation on which others could build. The chains had been broken in Dry Creek, and that breaking had sent ripples across a nation, inspiring others to look at their own communities and ask uncomfortable questions. And in a modest house near the edge of town, a former quiet rancher and a chief's daughter planned their testimony for Congress, knowing that their work was far from done but taking comfort in the fact that they wouldn't face tomorrow's challenges alone. The candle burned late as they wrote, choosing words carefully, telling truths that needed to be heard. Outside, the desert wind whispered across the land, carrying with it the promise of dawn and the hope of a better world, one broken chain at a time.